welcome to the latest edition of In Focus. I'm your host, Cassidy Jo Fortin. Today, our guest is an esteemed professor here at California State University Fullerton who has recently published a book titled Tweeting to Freedom. I would like to welcome Cal State Fullerton Communications Professor, Dr. Anthony R. Fellow.
Thank you, Cassidy Jo.
Yeah,
nice to be with you.
It's nice to have you here today. How about we just start with you telling us a little bit about yourself?
I've been a professor here in the Cal State system for over 30 years, starting at Cal State Los Angeles, which I enjoyed very much, and moved into the journalism program here and mostly teach courses in media history, media law, international communications, and I am also director of the Florence Program, which brings students to Italy in the summer and in the fall. And I'm a former chair of the Department of Communications and the Department of Film and Television Arts. And I've served on almost every committee in the university for faculty, and so
you've
been here a long time, yes, and I'm very busy, yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your book, Tweeting to Freedom.
Yes, that was a book of love. I think it's a tremendously interesting book, and it's about 32 countries of freedom-loving people around the world who are using social media to change their governments and to change their way of life. And it begins with an introduction about how social media, when we talk about social media, the internet, Twitter, Facebook, even mobile phones, how it's being used throughout the world. But it begins with various movements of how social media is used. And those movements include Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. How does he use new technologies to get these classified or unclassified documents out? He believes that governments and people should see these documents and they shouldn't be hidden. And we talk about, in the beginning, about how in small ways social media is used. For instance, in Poland, they've used social media to badger the government to get rid of using coal because the smog was so horrible in Krakow. And it was a success, and if you go to Poland today and Krakow, the air is cleaner because the government decided, we'll listen to these people and change the laws. And the same in Beijing. Beijing's using, the smog is so bad that they're using celebrities on social media and even common citizens saying, let's stop this. And so things are changing. And one of the interesting changes in the environmental subjects using social media is in London, where this gentleman, Robert Snittle, I think it was, just badgered every government official every day with health studies. And so when you go to London today and you can breathe fresh air, it's because of his use of social media and changing the attitude of the government. And then it goes into 32 countries and how they're using social media. And the United States is in there as a model, one of the largest chapters of how, because we're one of the largest users of social media along with China, and third is India. And there's 5 countries that have interested me the most, and I wrote the chapters on these chapters, and I'm impressed with them. I begin with Egypt, for instance, is a country that interests me because this was the beginning of the Arab Spring. And it started, there was so many human resources problems in this government of Mubarak. And so one gentleman, a young man, was in the internet cafe in Cairo and writing about the oppression of the police. And he was just dragged out on the streets and beaten to death. And so Wael Nouman, who was working for Facebook in Egypt, decides to put a Facebook page together and becomes the cause célèbre. And this movement begins in Egypt through Facebook, and people turn out, the largest crowds in Cairo, to stop the brutality of the Mubarak government. And the upshot was for 18 days, a number of people were sent to jail in the administration. Mubarak is out. In 18 days, the people of Egypt lived in euphoria. They thought, this is a new dream for us, and perhaps we will have the freedoms that we always wanted. After 18 days, Egypt is in just bad shape as it is, so it didn't last. So that's an example of using social media, but it has just gone by the wayside. And then I like to talk about India. India is amazing. I think there's 302 users of the internet and social media in India, which is the 3rd largest use in the world. And India, in your lifetime, and hopefully mine, will become the #1 country in the world, I think, as far as power and population and the knowledge that they have of technology. And what is interesting for me is that India right now, the women of India are using social media to put their rights on the forefront. And there was a gang rape of a woman in Delhi in 2012, which fomented this revolution. And with social media, they began with 4,000 women in the streets, and then it went larger than that to change the policies of India that women do have rights and that they're not going to stand for this anymore. And so I found that very interesting, how women are using it in India to change opinions. And then we talked a little bit about Iraq. Could you imagine Iraq? With this administration, they've kind of freed up Iraq a bit. So you see internet companies coming in. There's not a great usage. But what happened in Iraq is that social media is being used. This Rambo brigade fighter who fought ISIS came about, and he's become a star, a hero, which Iraq needed. And so that's being used to help fight ISIS. And ISIS is another one of those groups that we talk about separately in the beginning, because ISIS uses social media like no one in the world, because they're attracting young children who feel displaced, particularly in the United States and England. And as you know, in England, if you're an English citizen and you decide you want to go with ISIS and decide you don't like it, you can never return to England. You're finished. And Benjamin Hall, who's now a correspondent with Fox News, has written a book on Inside ISIS, and he and I talk a great deal. And he was with ISIS and almost killed. He wanted to do the inside of what was going on with ISIS. And he thinks they're the greatest users of social media that you can imagine.
Wow. And
then we talk about, my favorite country to talk about is Mexico. And Mexico is the most impressive country in the world. You wouldn't think about using social media. And one of the things is the Hispanic population likes to be social. They like the family unit. So social media is very, it's comfortable with the Hispanics. But Mexico is using social media in a number of ways. And what they're doing with social media today is helping the government. And they've gotten some help with the rock group Mana, which is going to be playing at the Hollywood Bowl this summer, I saw.
Very cool.
And Mana is very interesting. They go on stage and they're also very political, and they detest the president of Mexico, the current president, and they tell people begin and use social media to help kill the drug cartel in Mexico. And the drug cartel is helping to kill journalists, and the drug cartel uses social media wonderfully. They film themselves on YouTube when they're doing good things. If there's a disaster like an earthquake in Mexico, they will film them doing great things. And it gets, I think they got 900,000 hits. The president's of Mexico's State of the Union got 9,000. And so it shows what great use is. But what's happening in Mexico, which is bothersome for us, and we do talk about the last section of the book about the number of journalists being killed, which interests me. It's about 1,237 deaths. And it's journalists are being slaughtered every day in Mexico by the drug cartels, because the whole idea of brown envelope journalism, where you pay off the editors so they'll say something that you want said, or they won't say something. So an editor has to sit there in Mexico and say, do I want to risk the lives of my reporters, or do I just take the money? And there's been some very brutal murders. Some young women journalist, they just found her legs on the freeway, and they had a post with her head on it on her computer. And this is what the cartel is doing. And the cartel is very savvy with social media. They have the greatest technicians, and there's 36 technicians, including one IBM technician in Mexico, that are missing. So they don't send them to college, they kidnap them. And then when journalists are using digital media and talking about the cartel, then they have problems with their lives. But the Mexican people, which is amazing, they're using social media to rat on the cartel. When they see something happening, when they see the cartel harm, whether it's journalists or ordinary citizens in Mexico, they're calling up the police on their social media, and they're taking pictures with Instagram. And so I think the Mexicans are using social media to the greatest advantage, and it's going to be interesting to see what goes on there. And then my last country is North Korea, which I like to talk about, because you wouldn't think about social media in North Korea. But they have some internet sources. This president, the Rocket Man, as the president calls him, he's invented like Facebook, and he had them do some other internet, and then he takes it away from the people. There's only like 0.01%, if that, people using any type of social media in North Korea. But what's interesting about North Korea is that 77% of the population use mobile phones. And it was shocking for me that that on the border in the north with China is that the Chinese officials are turning their back in people who have left South Korea, refugees that have gone into the north, and political detainees who have escaped North Korea are amassing weapons, and they're going into the north. People don't know that across the border of China, with Chinese officials looking another way, there's weapons, there's hand grenades moving into North Korea. And now we have helium balloons from the south going into North Korea with American movies, with flash drives about how bad the regime is in North Korea to educate them. What we're thinking about, will there be a North Korean spring like in Egypt? And the problem right now is no, because you have to have communications. As you know, when you study media history, you have to have a community, and there is none in North Korea. There's no type of communications. So I was fascinated by all this, and we go into other countries, in Russia and the United States, and it's just been wonderful, because I teach international communications, so it's been, and you were in one of my classes, and you helped with this book, because one of these assignments dealt with looking at a country. We analyzed the government of that country, the economic structure, the journalists of that country. And so it came out of those assignments that this book, and I think it's a very important book. We say every Secretary of State should read this book.
Yes, and it's clear it talks about a lot of different things, and it's clear also how passionate you are about it. What inspired you to write the book?
I think it's because I teach international communications, and the co-author is Jim Willis, who was formerly, he's now retired from Azusa Pacific University, and both of us have been journalists. I spent 10 years of my early life covering the presidency, and Jim was really a foreign correspondent, and he still does some work for Oklahoma newspapers. But we had lunch all the time. And he said, "Would you be interested in doing a book like this?" And yeah, and I've always been interested in new technology. You know, the focus, social media is the #1 topic today. And the focus is on young people. How do young people use it? I am tremendously interested in how do young people get their political news. I'm fascinated. Why do they go vote Democratic or Republican? And in 2008, I got a wake-up call in my large history course, because we talked about this. And students, they didn't get their news from newspapers or television news. It's various sites. And they were only interested if they were an Obama supporter, they just read information about him. If they were a McCain supporter, they read information about him. Or if they were a Hillary supporter. And to me, that's what's destroying politics today, is because a newspaper gives you a plethora of information on both sides. And so I really worry about politics in this country. Do you know, James Fallows wrote a very important book about 15, 20 years ago. It's called Breaking the News. And he said the problem with democracy in America is going to be the press. He says the press is going to become very cynical about politics. And this will bring about the end of democracy. And I see it coming. I'm so, my feelings about the news media in America is just waning. I went to see The Press, you know, the movie, and I sat in the audience, and I turned to my wife. I heard Walter Cronkite speak, and I said, God, do we miss him? Because there's nobody who's really fair and objective anymore. And I want international news. You know, even I thought CNN would be the beacon and continue to be for international news, but it's just 24 hours of anti-Trump. Then you have Fox, 24 hours of pro-Trump. And so in Italy, I watch BBC and Al Jazeera and get my news. But to hear Walter Cronkite's tape in the movie, The Press, and to hear that, I said, oh my God, we need him today. And you know, Walter Cronkite used to come to Fullerton. He thought our dance and music department was the gem of America, a hidden gem in America. And we used to meet with him, and students would ask him questions. And so we need to get back to that type of journalism.
Right. And now that the book is complete, how do you feel?
I'm glad it's done, but I have other projects. You know, I'm interested. I want to do a book. I'm working on a book on women in the Civil War, as I mentioned. And I'm doing a book on taking students to Italy for 15 years. And it's a fun book. And then I want to do some research this next year as we approach 2020. It might take that long, of where students really the young people get their information about news and politics, and to really see if what James Fallows, it was a wake-up call for me. I thought that was the most important book, and I had my students read it 20 years ago. But I can see it now that the way journalism's going, it may spoil democracy instead of enhance democracy as the fourth estate.
And so the book is called Tweeting to Freedom. So let's talk a little bit about tweeting and the sort of power behind that.
Well, we did tweeting, and you know, we have a president who tweets a lot.
Yes.
And just this morning, when I looked at the statistics, his circulation of his tweets is really higher than any newspaper, and so there's some benefits to that. But internationally, we see it, as I mentioned, in the 5 countries. Not so much in North Korea, but certainly in Mexico. Mexico will have 12.2 million people tweeting in 2018, which is a tremendous amount in a short time for that country. And again, they're using it to help government officials capture people who are killing journalists and who are killing people who are against the cartel. The cartel is very vicious, and they control the government. And I hope someday we see in Mexico the use of social media to bring about a strong president that will fight the cartel, because certainly in the past few years, I'm in politics, and a number of our local politicians who are from Mexico, or their families, have went to visit them and ended up dead in Tijuana. And so something has to be done there. So I'm hoping that tweeting and Facebook, which is more an older person's, young people aren't using Facebook anymore, but I think there's great changes we can see with social media. I think it's fascinating, and I wish I was younger so I could participate in this more. But the book was exciting to do, and I think it's an important book that certainly people in government who do international should read it.
Agreed. And you've touched a lot on how other countries are using social media. Are there any other major differences in how other countries use it in comparison to here at the United States?
Well, I think in the United States we use it more for YouTube's entertainment, and certainly we're the largest users of social media. And today, you can do a movie on social media. And so I tell faculty, I said, in probably 5 years, I know kids in kindergarten and first, second grade doing little term papers and movies with iMovie, that we're not going to have to have these introductory courses in motion picture and documentary, and because students are going to know how to do it.
Right.
And I hope I'm around then, because that will be exciting to move on to take these kids and move on to very exciting things. But through social media, it gives you the world. You can see what's going on in the world, and it just makes us a global community. It's one world, because basically we are. But the promises of radio were to bring about peace. It was to bring about universal education, to bring about religion, universal religion, and universal democracy. And then television comes on the scene, and those same promises of that medium were there. And now with social media, we're thinking maybe it can happen, but media has failed us in most of those areas, so we'll see what happens. But it's exciting. Innovation, who knows what's going to happen next? And the most important thing, I think, with social media is that people are becoming more aware of their own health and their role in society, and that they can be vocal. You don't have to really run for office today. And you have a blog, and you can give your point of view. And we see today that legislation can be influenced through social media. So it's going to be interesting. We're moving. We could, there's all these futuristic books say we're moving into a direct democracy maybe, where we don't need all this stuff in Washington, in that congressional representatives could just do a vote of the people instantly. How do they feel about this law?
Right.
And then vote that way. Who knows?
Right. And then do you have any advice for someone who's interested in writing a book like this?
Yeah, it takes patience. The media history book, which is doing well in the nation, took 5 years. This took about 2 years. And the problem with this book is it's a very reputable publisher, ABC, Clio in Santa Barbara, is plagiarism is very, it's on top of their mind when you do a book. And so they put all the pages through a detector. And the problem with this book is that we use a lot of dates of birth in some of the politicians when they were in office. And so it came back, a lot of it plagiarized. And so that was disconcerting, because you had to go back, and it is plagiarized because that's fact. People were born those dates, but the machine didn't pick it up. So it took a lot more work to go through this and iron out those difficulties. But I'm very proud of the book. And,
you should be. You definitely should be. And so earlier you did mention the Florence Program, so let's talk a little bit more about that now.
Okay. The Florence Program. I'm Italian. My grandparents came from Italy, and I'm going through the process now of trying to get an Italian passport, because I'm there too often. Yeah. And so at first I wanted to share my heritage, because being Italian is, and when I was young, we used to sit around grandmother's table on Sundays and with other Italians, and all these people made something of their life. They came through. I remember my grandparents going through Ellis Island, telling us about that, and having to learn English. We used to quiz my grandmother when she was getting her test, and so it was exciting. I love being Italian, and so I thought I would share that with students. And so the program began 15 years ago with 7 students from. I had the year before the humanities program. We had a consortium here at Fullerton, in San Diego, and Long Beach, and I took 70 students to Florence, because we have a Cal State Florence in Italy, which is mostly caters to engineering and architecture for the Cal Polys. And I was the director of that. And I came back and I told the associate dean, Fred Zamper at the time, who was really the most innovative of faculty members, that I wanted a program. I wanted to go every year. And so he devised this. He got me in touch with AFS. And the next year I went with a few more students. And then I asked Cal State San Bernardino and Dr. Robin Larson to come in. She was a professor of communications there. And so San Bernardino came in, and the program began to grow. And then right now, Cal State Long Beach is part of the fall program. So our students can take classes from Cal State Long Beach and Cal State Fullerton. And so the semester program I started 3 years ago is growing, and it's kind of hurt the summer program. We used to have 45 students, and now it's mostly 20 and 20. And the university has been good with IRA funds to help subsidize it, because semester-long program is expensive, and we try to give the students as much money as possible. But it's life-changing, and my wife always tells me, and my wife was Chancellor Reed's press secretary, and so knows the Cal State system. And she says, Tony, these students will forget the president of the university, they'll forget who the dean is, but they will never forget you, because it's life-changing. And these students, as you know, they still stay together. At least they meet once a year for dinner, some of them, the cohorts. And we're thinking about having a party. The provost has told me that she would spend some money having a reunion here in the Arboretum. And then we're thinking of eventually maybe flying over the students who want to back to Florence for an anniversary party. And so we'll see how that goes.
Sign me up.
And I was planning, before President Garcia left, we were planning this fall a major conference on women directors. And I was going to have her become the keynote speaker, because she asked me before she, when I was honored last year as a longtime employee here, she whispered in my ear, says, "Tony, when am I coming to Florence?" And so we had planned this, and then in my last few weeks in Florence, she announced she was leaving. So that didn't work.
Right.
But it's a wonderful program, and I got also the idea for it because President Milt Gordon, when he was here, he gave a State of the College address, and he said, "I want all students to go abroad eventually for a semester." He was very international. And so when he said that, it started ticking in my mind that I'm going to put a program together. So I talked to President Gordon. I said, "I want to do a program in Italy." And he said, "Tony, don't tell me that. Just do it." And so I did it, and it became a great success. And he was so happy. And we named the program after him. We haven't changed the name yet, but and then he would refer all questions. And we're not just talking about study abroad, but when it came to politics of Italy, the government of Italy, he would refer them to me. And I didn't, but that was very nice of him to do that.
Definitely.
It's a wonderful program, and all students should take advantage of it. It's a program we've never had any problems, because Florence is very safe, and we always know where students are at, and the apartments are very nice that students stay in. It's in walking distance of the education center, and the faculty are wonderful, and so it's been a blessing.
Yeah.
Not many faculty members do what I do when it comes to study abroad.
And I can attest, I was a part of it. I
Yes,
loved it absolutely.
You're a great student. Everybody loved you.
Thank you. What sort of change do you see in the students from when they first go to when they come home?
Do you know what, speaking of social media, this all fits in, is some students in the past few years have told me they never interact like face-to-face, like you and me here. They interact on their cell phone and on the computer and social media sites, but they find it very strange to be in this cohort of people, and they travel together, and the men on the trip protect the women students, and they say it's like family, and they become best friends for the rest of their life. And these students are just flabbergasted that they're communicating face to face, and so I think that's the biggest change, and that's a good change.
And then, do you have any hopes for the program in the future?
Yeah, I'm bringing on new faculty. We have Professor Michael McAlexander's coming in the summer now. Robin has decided to retire from summer and just teach fall. And I'm thinking more and more, I've been thinking of this idea of bringing more adults. I wanted to have an adult program along with the student program, because there's a lot of seniors and more mature adults who want to come, but they don't want to get on a bus and travel. They want to do things. They want to participate in art, and they want to participate in listening and learning still. So we thought, well, we could have them in class, and we could have art lessons for them and Italian lessons, and more active for not for a whole semester. And so that's been a goal of mine. But yeah, I'm also thinking of other things in my life. I'm much into politics, as you know. I'm elected office, and the call of higher office always is there, and that may happen soon. We'll see.
Very nice. And then, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I was a journalist for 10 years. It was the most exciting 10 years of my life. And when I teach journalism today, which I don't teach very often, I don't think the students are going to have that excitement. It was when I became an editor to turn out 5 different zone pages, like front pages to different zones of our readership, and to have that excitement in the morning where you have a budget, but you don't know how long the stories are coming in. And to put us within an hour and a half to put together a newspaper, it's a miracle. And you have advertising coming in. And I used to always love, after the newspaper, to go to the back shop and watch the presses roll. And it was a wonderful, and then you spend your day interviewing. You know, I've met presidents. I covered President Carter. I covered President Ford. I was a Democrat, and my whole team were Democrats except one Republican. We fell in love with Gerald Ford and Betty Ford. And then I was able to cover, as a student, I covered Richard Nixon, and that was interesting. And so, that's how I got involved in politics. When I started covering people and interviewing them, they would come into my office, and then I sat there, especially with congressional candidates, saying, I know more than you do, you know. And so I got involved in politics. That's when I left the newspaper, and I always wanted to teach. I always wanted to be a teacher, and I wanted to go back to my high school, Rosemead High School, and teach. And 3 years ago, they honored me to be the graduation speaker.
Very nice.
And so that was nice. But I decided to go on and applied at USC. I only applied at one graduate program, the Annenberg School, because that was the cutting edge of journalism in America. And went there for 5 years, got my PhD, and I thank God for Walter Annenberg, who paid every penny of my PhD. And I left without any debt. And then Annenberg asked me if I would come back, and I taught there for 5 years while teaching here. So I was teaching full-time at 2 colleges, and that was too much, so I had to leave USC. But they needed somebody in media history, so they called here and asked me if I would do it. And so, but being a university professor is the greatest job in the world. I've never not wanted to come to school. I love the interaction. I love doing online teaching now, which I do a lot of, probably more than any professor. And it's like putting documentaries together. And the future is always exciting. And I don't know, the next few years might be politics. It might be doing some new type of tours to Italy. I don't know. I'd like to live in Italy more, but my political positions here, I have to return for meetings, so it's not possible right now. But the future is wonderful, and I tell students, and I like especially the young students, be innovative. Somebody in one of our classes in the United States is going to figure out the financial aspects of journalism and how newspapers could become profitable, and what that model will be will change the world also. But the sorry state is what's happening with the news media today. We've got to get back to news. We've got to get back to what's happening around the world. I don't think Americans understand what's going on in the world today, because we're so focused on hatred of a candidate or an opponent with the media, and it's just too bad. We're not really informed people anymore.
But I really like what you said about how the future is wonderful and there are a bunch of possibilities out there.
Oh, the future is amazing. It's going to be amazing. You're going to live longer. I hope we can get some cures for these diseases that will help people. But I just think I've had a wonderful life as a professor. It's the greatest life in the world, and I've loved every minute of it and have never been bored.
That's really great. Well, that is all the time that we have for today. I would like to thank our guest, Anthony Fellow, once again for joining us. I'm Cassidy Jo Fortin. Thank you for watching In Focus.